The news cycle directs your attention to the sky. A North Korean missile launch, linked to the recent geopolitical crisis, becomes the dominant image. Netanyahu warns of escalation. The kinetic theater in Ukraine grinds on through the winter. This is the accepted narrative of risk. Explosive, visible, and symmetric. This is a deliberate misdirection. The mathematical certainty is that actors facing conventional stalemate are incentivized towards asymmetric vectors. The true threat is not the sound of a launch, it is the strategic value of absolute silence. While legacy media focuses on kinetic costs, a silent protocol is being executed. CSIS reports detail extensive mapping of subsea data corridors. These are the fiber optic cables carrying over 99% of global financial and intelligence data. This is the primary vector. The secondary vector is orbital, not destroying satellites, but temporarily blinding them. The rising frequency of Chinese cyber attacks noted by Taiwan's NSB is the testing ground for this capability. The objective is not destruction, but induced paralysis. This two-pronged assault on data transmission, subsea and orbital, is designed to create a single entity, the blind Leviathan, a global superpower stripped of its sensory apparatus. It retains its full kinetic strike capability, but loses all intelligence, all targeting data, and all financial visibility. It cannot confirm, it can only guess. In this state of induced blindness, a global launch-on warning posture becomes the default, not for nuclear assets, but for financial liquidity. The moment data streams go dark, a systemic solvency crisis is triggered. This isn't warfare as you know it. It is the weaponization of silence. The protocol is triggered by a simple calculation: solvency. When a state's kinetic war effort becomes a domestic liability, draining treasure and political capital with no clear path to victory, it is facing a solvency crisis. The war is no longer a strategic asset. It is a bad debt on the national balance sheet. According to RUSI analysis, Russia's protracted campaign, marked by stalemates like the repelled attacks on the Oleksandrivsk direction, has become an unpopular and unsustainable liability. This failure in symmetric warfare does not lead to de-escalation. Instead, it creates a mathematical incentive to pivot. The state must find a cheaper, higher-impact form of leverage. Weakness in the conventional domain forces a calculated shift to asymmetric vectors: cyber, sabotage, nuclear posturing. This is not a desperate gamble. It is the activation of a pre-planned doctrine for states that cannot afford to win and cannot afford to lose. The entire protocol of asymmetric escalation is underwritten by a brutal economic equation. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, have quantified this liability. A state invests $5 million in a main battle tank, a kinetic asset representing decades of industrial capacity. An opposing force neutralizes it with a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a battle. It is an economic liquidation. The defender is imposing a 10,000 to 1 cost leverage against the aggressor, creating an industrial-scale solvency crisis on the battlefield. This inversion of kinetic cost is the democratization of violence. The state's historical monopoly on projecting decisive lethal force has been fundamentally broken. It no longer requires a national treasury or a sprawling military-industrial complex. The barrier to entry for high-consequence lethality is collapsing, making it a distributed liability across the global system. This empowers actors who operate entirely outside of conventional deterrence frameworks. When a nation-state faces this type of attritional insolvency, its strategic calculus becomes desperate. The mathematical certainty of defeat in a symmetric kinetic conflict, as documented in theaters like Ukraine, becomes the primary accelerant for deploying asymmetric liabilities. Unable to afford the kinetic cost, the actor is forced to escalate. This creates a direct vector from battlefield economics to systemic risk, including rising Chinese cyber attacks and nuclear posturing from states like North Korea and Iran. The inability to win the tank battle forces the hand toward non-kinetic, high-consequence warfare. The map you've been shown is obsolete. The primary battlefront is not a line in the sand, but a vulnerability in the code of our own systems. The conventional stalemate, documented on the Oleksandrivsk direction in Ukraine, is not the war. It is the catalyst. It has proven that kinetic conflict results in a negative yield solvency crisis for all participants. This battlefield failure creates a mathematical incentive for asymmetric escalation. The playbook is simple. If you cannot win symmetrically, you change the game. We are seeing the protocol deployed in real time. A Taipei Times report confirms Chinese cyber attacks are not just rising. They are becoming the primary vector of state power projection. It is cheaper than an aircraft carrier and infinitely more deniable. This blueprint is being replicated. North Korea explicitly links its missile launches to the recent geopolitical crisis. This is not rogue behavior. It is a calculated adoption of the escalation protocol. Similarly, Netanyahu's warning that all bets are off against Iran is a public declaration of a shift to a launch-on-warning posture. Both are admissions that the old rules of engagement are an unacceptable liability. But where is this playbook tested? It is tested in the gray zone. According to analysts at CSIS, recent regional instability, from supply chain disruptions in Canada to grid failure warnings in South Africa, must be analyzed as proxy laboratories. These are not random crises. They are controlled experiments to field test the protocols of systemic disruption with plausible deniability, refining the tactics needed to fracture a modern state from within. This is not a mistake. It's a feature of the new conflict doctrine. The logical end point of these laboratory tests is graduation. The prediction is therefore not a matter of if, but when. Within 18 months, expect a coordinated, multi-pronged cyber offensive against the critical infrastructure of a G7 nation, disguised as hacktivism. The objective will not be destruction, but to create a cascading economic solvency crisis, proving that a keyboard can be a more effective accelerant of collapse than a kinetic weapon. The doctrine is launch on warning. It is a Cold War protocol designed to ensure a state can retaliate before its own nuclear assets are liquidated in a first strike. The logic is a zero-sum calculation. If inbound missiles are confirmed, you launch everything. Hesitation equals extinction. This is not a theory, it is active policy. The accelerant for this protocol is no longer a flock of geese on radar. It is a targeted, systemic attack. A recent National Security Bureau report, documented by the Taipei Times, confirms that Chinese cyber attacks are rising. These are not random hacks. They are strategic probes designed to map and exploit vulnerabilities in military-grade sensor networks. This creates what CSIS analysts define as the fog of digital war. When a nation's early warning radar is blinded by a cyber attack, the commander faces a solvency crisis of information. The decision window is minutes. Is it a system failure or a deliberate blackout masking an incoming kinetic strike? The protocol mathematically forces a choice based on fear. The cost of assuming it's a glitch when it's an attack is national annihilation. This is the blueprint for asymmetric escalation, using a low-cost cyber vector to trigger a high-consequence nuclear liability for your adversary. The inability to win symmetrically becomes the very weapon that holds the world hostage. The protocol of asymmetric escalation dictates that a test of the system is not a possibility, but a mathematical necessity. Actors facing kinetic stalemate, as documented in the Ukrainian theater, source number 1, are incentivized to bypass conventional costs. The first event will not be the main offensive. It will be a calibration shot. The vector is already established. A report from Taipei's National Security Bureau confirms Chinese cyber attacks are rising. Source number 4. This is the normalization of the battle space. CSIS analysis confirms state-level actors are prepositioning digital asset inside critical Western infrastructure, awaiting an activation order. The goal is to engineer a solvency crisis, not a battlefield victory. The target selection protocol prioritizes maximum economic liability with minimum attribution. It must be an event severe enough to test Western response protocols, but deniable enough to prevent a kinetic response posture, a dynamic observed in tensions involving both Iran and North Korea. Sources, Macro 2, number 3. This makes a Tier 1 logistical hub the optimal target for a deniable systems failure. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a multi-day shutdown of a major Western port's entire digital logistics and crane operation system. It will be publicly attributed to a cascading software failure, or a non-state ransomware entity, but it will function as a state-level test of economic resilience. This is the overture.